Okay, today we're talking about the ideas and events that lead to the American Revolution. What are the big ideas that we're talking about in this section? How did other ideas and events contribute to the revolution? What thinkers, what historical movements contributed to the revolution? And of course, what are the key events of the revolution? Let's start out by continuing our discussion of trade. Triangular trade had helped the colonies grow. This led to the idea of mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic idea that holds that a country gets richer by selling more than it buys. In the case of the colonies, this means that the colonies can grow all the cotton they want, but t-shirts will be made in Britain. So what's worth more, a t-shirt or a bunch of cotton balls? And this is the central idea to mercantilism. The colony grows raw materials. They send them to the mother country who makes manufactured goods. So in an ideal world for the British, they keep getting more money. The colonists weren't even allowed to trade with, say, France. See, if the colonists bought French shirts, it meant less money for Britain. So smuggling became common. In fact, many of our founding fathers were smugglers trying to make a living. How do you think mercantilism would contribute to the revolution? Events in England would also set the stage for the American Revolution. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred. Parliament, the British legislative branch, ran off Catholic Scottish King James II. He was replaced with James's daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William. Why was the revolution glorious? Well, first of all, there was no bloodshed. And importantly, Parliament is the boss now. They have increased their power over the king because, well, they've shown they can kick a king out. And it was also glorious because of the new powers given to the English citizens. So the colonies are pretty excited about this. There's greater freedom of speech, there's no cruel and unusual punishment, and English citizens are to get jury trials. So the colonists are hoping that these same privileges will extend to them. In the colonies, they immediately gained control over their own affairs and kicked out a very unpopular royal governor. Consider how the idea of power over the king might inspire the colonists. Alright, on to John Locke. He's our first big important thinker. In 1690, he writes that everyone is born with certain natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and that a king has to protect those rights, or maybe some kind of glorious revolution might be alright. Locke wasn't promoting radical rebellion. He could have gotten in a lot of trouble for that, but Locke's idea that the government should take care of the people was pretty radical at the time, and his language would be copied by Thomas Jefferson when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Locke is not the only important thinker of this period that we call the Enlightenment. We also get the ideas of Rousseau, who believed in individual rights, and Montesquieu, who believed in separation of powers. Personal rights, separation of powers, does that sound familiar? The big key here is to know that the Enlightenment thinkers raised the value of the individual. We're really pushing this idea of the importance of the individual. Another big event that supports this occurred around the same time in the mid-1700s and is called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a huge religious movement. In religious terms, people became born again and several new Protestant denominations were created. But it really pushes the idea that everyone is equal before God, as people of all stripes, wealthy and poor, were welcomed into their churches, and even numerous slaves were given the opportunity to join Christian churches. And if everyone is equal before God, what does this say about kings? What does this say about slavery? This would be a huge event in later American history. So let's review. What did Locke call for? The natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Can you think of any documents that we're going to be looking at that reflect that language? How did the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening influence United States history? They increased the value of the individual, and they increased challenges to authority. Political events in Europe would also move the colonies closer to rebellion. The French and Indian War was a conflict over land in the Ohio River Valley in the United States between the French and the English. The Indians actually fought on both sides. It was fought on more than one continent and is called the 7 Years' War in Europe. It ended with the Treaty of Paris, and England had a ton of debt. A little fun fact, the idea of Indians scalping whites starts here, but scalping was an idea that the English came up with. They would pay a bounty on every French scalp that the Indians took. The consequences of the French and Indian War were huge. Britain was in tremendous debt now, so the King of England really didn't want to fight any more expensive wars. The Proclamation of 1763 is passed, and it banned further settlement to the west. The idea was to avoid a costly Indian war. But how do you think the settlers thought about being told not to expand their nation? Also, the king wants to raise taxes. The first of these is the stamp tax. The stamp tax was a small tax on many published documents. The dollar amount was not that high. But how do you think the colonists felt about paying taxes to a king thousands away? England upped the stakes with the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were tougher taxes, and the Crown started arresting smugglers. Things came to a boil at the Boston Massacre, where English troops fired on colonists. This let off a little steam, and most of the Townshend Acts were removed, leaving just the tea tax. Even with the removal of most of the Townshend Acts, we were now moving closer to war. The ideas of the Enlightenment and general resentment towards the Crown were growing. The colonists created committees of correspondence. You wouldn't think that such things were a big deal, but while in modern times you can run a revolution with Twitter, as was the case in the Arab Spring in Egypt, back then communicating between cities took a fair amount of work. These colonial committees of correspondence would help to organize the colonies and help the colonial leaders plan. Parliament passed the Tea Act to help the British East India Company, but this hurt American merchants and smugglers. So the colonists had a Boston Tea Party, threw out a bunch of tea, raging the English. The Boston Tea Party led to numerous British rulings called the Intolerable Acts. These took away much colonial power, sent British troops to Boston, and banned town meetings. In response, in 1774, the colonists form a Continental Congress. War seems inevitable. Great Britain responded with harsher rules. The colonials, sensing that a fight was coming, started stockpiling weapons and training the Minutemen, soldiers who would be ready to fight in a minute. While most colonists lingered at the British treatment, there was division between the Loyalists or Tories, who supported the king, and the more radical Patriots or Whigs. Remember, most people were British in heritage, and many just wanted the same rights that British citizens had. But the situation worsened, leading to the first battles at Lexington and Concord. Quickly, the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander, but before he could even take over, the Continentals scored a moral victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is the famous "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes" battle, and while it was a stalemate, it gave the colonists confidence. Say you had to ask an outsider before the war, who would have been picked to win the war? Britain or the colonials? What would be the likely answer? Probably the British. The British were the finest army in the world. They were arguably the wealthiest nation in the world. But the Americans were on home ground. Also, the colonials used guerrilla warfare. Additionally, the war was not popular in Britain. When you add in the French support after 1778, the odds eventually turned in favor of the colonials. A long, expensive, unpopular overseas war fought between an incredibly nation and a smaller nation? What do you think? Does this sound like any later wars in history? With the Treaty of Paris, the United States was created, but it was far from complete as a nation. We'll be looking at the writings of the Enlightenment philosophers and the Declaration of Independence in class, so be prepared to talk about the ideas and thinkers that led to our independence.